Thank you so much, Ian. Can everybody hear me all right? Yeah, not so sure at the back. Can you hear me at the back? Good, that's fine. But what I do need is the lights. If you kill the lights, I can't read my script. So we have to have a bit of light in order to be able to do this. That's better. But anyway, it's a great pleasure to be here in Salisbury again. And I know from past experience you're a wonderfully enthusiastic audience. So without further ado, early on the morning of the 16th of October, 1962, US President John F. Kennedy was presented with secret air reconnaissance photos which revealed that the Soviet Union had deployed nuclear missiles in Cuba, 90 miles from the US mainland. That revelation triggered the biggest crisis of the Cold War, and indeed the gravest threat thus far to the survival of mankind. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev said afterwards, "We were truly on the verge of war." Kennedy's first words were, "We're probably going to have to bomb them." Then he summoned his brother Bobby, the administration's Attorney General, who observed with a statesman-like elegance that President Trump's administration would appreciate, "Oh, shit, those sons of bitch Russians." America's armed forces prepared to invade Fidel Castro's island. At one of the first top-secret White House conferences that followed the photos, it was agreed that the Russians would probably respond by seizing West Berlin, an Allied enclave amidst communist East Germany. Robert Kennedy demanded, "Then what do we do?" Maxwell Taylor, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, shrugged, "Go to general war if it's in the interests of ours." The president asked, "You mean nuclear exchange?" Taylor assented, almost insouciantly. "Guess you have to." The audio tapes testify to JFK's shocked disbelief. He said seconds later, "Now the question really is to what action we take which lessens the chances of a nuclear exchange, which obviously is the final failure." The final failure. The final failure. It's hard to overstate the importance of such language from the president. Jack Kennedy understood, as some others around the cabinet table did not, the supreme gravity of the peril for all mankind. When I started out to write my book, the missile crisis sounded like ancient history. Yet today, amid the Russian rape of Ukraine and President Putin's repeated nuclear threats, those events possess a frightening new immediacy. Once again, a reckless gambler occupies the Kremlin. We need to learn from the past how best the West can confront Putin's menaces without precipitating Armageddon. In 1962, the Soviet Union was tottering. Few people in the West realized this, but one man did: Khrushchev. The Kremlin's tenant was bitterly conscious that the capitalists whom he despised, people who had suffered far less than his own in the so-called Great Patriotic War against the Nazis, were getting richer and richer, while most Russians lived in threadbare poverty. Khrushchev was convinced that socialism was destined to triumph, eventually. Meanwhile, however, Americans watched color TV and ate steak, while any Russians lucky enough to own tiny black and white sets had to view their screens through water-filled magnifiers, and in some regions, bread was rationed. Their leader, desperate for good news, wanted a coup that would showcase supposed Soviet might. He sought this on the Caribbean island conquered 3 years earlier by his new best friends, Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. Khrushchev loved to holiday on the Black Sea. Gazing across its waters through binoculars, he was nagged by bitterness that only a few hundred miles away in Turkey were sighted American Jupiter nuclear missiles aimed at Russia. One day in April 1962, he suddenly demanded of his defense minister, Marshal Malinowski, "What if we throw a hedgehog down Uncle Sam's pants?" He had conceived a grandstand play, secretly to ship into Cuba ballistic missiles capable of destroying half the United States, and then to stun the world with an announcement of them. The Kremlin Presidium rubber-stamped the proposal. Nobody questioned Soviet generals' crazy claim that the missiles could be hidden from American reconnaissance under palm trees. Khrushchev promised his comrades that Cuba could thus be protected from threatened invasion, and that the 17-1 US superiority in nuclear warheads could be tilted against the capitalists. Of course, the Americans wouldn't like this, but they'd have to lump it. Legally, the Cubans were as much entitled to host Soviet nuclear weapons as the Turks, Italians, and British were American ones. And yet, inevitably, when the sensation was revealed to the White House, the Americans responded with outrage, not least about the barrage of lies behind which the Russians acted, directly comparable with their 2022 to 25 rhetoric. In the days before Kennedy revealed his secret knowledge to the world, his armed forces chiefs demanded a violent response. Above all, the Air Force's General Curtis LeMay, a monster straight from the cast of the classic nuclear horror movie, Dr. Strangelove. LeMay challenged his president, saying, "We won't have any choice except direct military action." If the US attempted a mere blockade of Cuba, the first thing that's going to happen is your missiles are going to disappear into the woods. This is almost as bad as the appeasement at Munich. We're just going to gradually drift into a war under conditions that are at great disadvantage to us. LeMay then used language that was both impertinent and malicious. The president, said the airman, had promised the American people action against offensive weapons. "I think that a blockade and political talk would be considered a pretty weak response. You're in a pretty bad fix." The president, astounded by LeMay's barrage of insults, demanded, "What did you say?" The general doubled down. "You're in a pretty bad fix." Kennedy, with disarming humor, batted back at the air chief, "You're right in there in it with me." There was a flicker of uneasy laughter around the table before JFK added an emphasis, "Personally." In the first week of the crisis, before Kennedy went public, he came under enormous pressure as the chiefs of staff delivered a unanimous recommendation for a surprise air and amphibious assault, which would, of course, kill thousands of Russians as well as Cubans. It's chilling today to read in the archives later testimony by those American generals asserting their impenitence for having urged war, their enduring conviction that the US could have secured a, quote, decisive victory over the Russians, their contempt for the president who, quote, chickened out. Kennedy later told the economist J.K. Galbraith, "Ken, you will never know how much bad advice I received. US Marines chanted as they trained, 'Where we gonna go? Gonna go to Cuba. What we gonna do? Gonna castrate Castro.' What the Americans then had no inkling of was that in addition to the ballistic missiles in Cuba, the Russians had also deployed scores of tactical nuclear weapons together with 43,000 troops. If US forces had attacked, whatever the contributors of the Kremlin, it seems to me unlikely that the Russians on the ground would have accepted punishing losses and probable defeat without unleashing some of this deadly arsenal. Escalation would have been almost inevitable. The 1962 White House exuded an aura of power unrivaled by any other center of government in the world, and indeed unmatched by today's US presidency. Kennedy himself was a child of privilege who introduced into his administration energy, wit, and culture. Resident historian Arthur Schlesinger wrote euphorically, "Never had girls seemed so pretty, tunes so melodious, and evenings so blithe and unconstrained." Though the president knew nothing of the bullets approaching him from the Dallas book depository, he was always in a hurry. On a 1951 world trip, this then congressman, with a passion for poetry, scribbled down lines from Andrew Marble. "But at my back I always hear Time's winged chariot hurrying near." Yet there was a profound tension between Kennedy's outward appearance of vigor and beauty and an inner reality of frailty and pain. He inherited from his near gangster father ruthlessness and lack of sentiment, while some of his finest rhetoric addressed the plight of less fortunate humanity. His actions showed little concern for it. There was a coldness manifested in passionate sexual couplings. One of his teenage lovers, Mimi Beardsley, plausibly recorded that he never kissed her on the lips. In the words of one intimate, "He was nice to people, but heedless of people." In September 1962, before the missile storm broke, many observers believed that his administration was distinguished more by style than substance. Despite all the media hype about Camelot, the knights of Jack Kennedy's Round Table seemed to have a clearer view of what armor they would wear than of the foes they would vanquish. It's hard to reconcile the president's professed liberal principles with his request to entertainer and Kennedy supporter Sammy Davis Jr. to stay away from his star-studded Washington inaugural ball because of the unpopularity in conservative America of Davis's interracial marriage to Swedish actress May Britt. Yet the missile crisis proved Kennedy's finest hour. On Saturday, 21st October 1962, after days and nights of fierce argument, he determined to defy many of his own advisors. America would not immediately resort to shooting. Instead, he decreed that on Monday, 2 days later, he would reveal the missiles to the world, and the US Navy would impose a blockade on Cuba. After Kennedy read Ted Sorensen's draft of his intended word to the nation, he turned to the two aides beside him. "We are very, very close to war." Yet then his sense of black humor broke through. "And there is not room in the White House shelter for all of us." At 7 p.m. on Monday, 22nd of October, US TV programming was cancelled to make way for the president's statement from the Oval Office. Kennedy delivered words that echoed around the world. The president announced his blockade and stated that the US would regard any nuclear weapon launched from Cuba as representing an attack requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. From the moment Kennedy broadcast, Nikita Khrushchev knew himself in deep trouble. He told the Kremlin Politburo, "We do not want to unleash a war. We simply want to frighten and restrain the USA in the matter of Cuba." But the Soviet commander on the island placed his forces on full alert. Marshal Malinovsky proposed to dispatch an order. All means of defense should be in a state of readiness. Khrushchev belatedly grasped the chasm this would open. If Soviet forces on the island were to use all means without exception, he told Malinovsky, that would include the missiles. Doesn't that mean the start of a thermonuclear war? How can we imagine such a thing? He and most of his colleagues in those dark hours inside the Kremlin were suddenly frightened men, probably as frightened as they'd ever been in lives richly endowed with terror. Despite Khrushchev's private realization that he'd have to back off, for almost a week he kept the world trapped in terror by broadcasting defiance and new threats. The mood of that time in the West isn't easy to recapture. There was an instinctive disbelief in annihilation amid commonplaces that were all around us. I myself was a teenage schoolboy preoccupied with escaping football. The historian Peter Hennessy has written wittily of his horror on discovering that the Soviet Union had earmarked 5 nuclear megatons for Liverpool. Had these been unleashed in 1962, Peter observed, before the imminent dawning of the Beatles and Liverpool Sound, whatever posterity was left after the city's vaporization might have supposed that Cliff Richard represented the creative pinnacle of British pop music. Graham Perry was a 17-year-old grammar school sixth former in Kent. He and his fellow pupils, waiting for their maths teacher to arrive for a lesson, discussed the crisis. A very pretty girl named Gillian, and remember these were still pretty virginal teenage times, explained how, if doom beckoned, she and her friends proposed to spend their last moments on earth with a clutch of fortunate boys. And then she added, you know, if there's one of these 4-minute warnings and then it turns out to have been a false alarm, some of us girls are going to look pretty stupid. A Soviet attaché at the United Nations in New York told journalist Murray Kempton that he felt unable to attend a performance by a visiting Russian violinist because, said the diplomat gravely, we must meet to consider whether we are to evacuate. I do not want to be here when the Russian bomb falls. This remark caused Kempton to write, there are red dawns which even the best of Bolsheviks do not wish to see. Elsewhere around the world, German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer told his nation that the crisis represented the gravest threat to peace since 1945. In Buenos Aires, American conservatives' favorite evangelist Billy Graham preached to 10,000 people on the end of the world. The subsequent history of the missile crisis is that of the Soviet Union writhing and twisting to extricate itself without humiliation. And all the while, nuclear disaster could have happened through accident or miscalculation. There were episodes such as that involving a Russian submarine 600 miles out in the Atlantic. Its captain, uncertain whether on the surface war had broken out, allegedly threatened to fire his nuclear torpedo when harassed by US warships. Junior officers had discretion over the use of weapons of mass destruction, which could have unleashed a catastrophe wholly unintended by either the Kremlin or the White House. In Britain, opinion was deeply divided. Many people, including privately Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, thought nothing at stake in Cuba worth a nuclear war. In the days following Kennedy's broadcast, in many capitals, demonstrations against the US mustered thousands of noisy people. Dean Rusk observed ruefully at the White House, the mobs that we stimulated turned up in London instead of Havana. Bertram Russell's CND people stormed the embassy there. The Guardian editorialized, if Khrushchev has really brought in nuclear missiles, he's done so to demonstrate to the US and the world the meaning of American bases close to the Soviet frontier. The paper's conditional was significant. Millions were initially unwilling to accept the narrative of a US president. The Times, likewise, suggested that given the excesses of earlier American behavior towards Cuba, the Bay of Pigs invasion and such like, the British people were entitled to be, quote, extremely wary about Washington's account. The Times leader concluded, "It is of the utmost importance that American objectives remain limited. They are not to topple Castro or defeat communism." Yet another Times editorial acknowledged that whatever happened to the Soviet missiles in Cuba, the American ones in Turkey ought to go. None of this could be described as an unreserved vote of British support. The biggest British beneficiaries of the crisis were the makers of the first James Bond film, Dr. No, which had opened in London 2 weeks earlier to poor reviews and low box office takings. Ian Fleming's fantastic tale of a Chinese millionaire rocket fancier in the Caribbean on the payroll of Moscow suddenly seemed topical. The film became hugely popular and profitable. At 10 a.m. on the 24th of October, the USAF's Strategic Air Command was summoned to DEFCON 2, an alert status just one step short of war. SACs, bombers and crews were primed to strike in a fashion terrifyingly close to the Strangelove movie. Regional commanders possessed authority to launch their nuclear weapons without orders from Washington if they had, quote, unambiguous evidence that war had started. It was extraordinary to have mandated such unstable figures as Curtis LeMay to precipitate Armageddon. Khrushchev privately raged at Kennedy. He knew that he himself was in deep trouble, but he was still blustering. An American tycoon visiting Moscow was summoned to the Kremlin on the 24th to face a tirade from its master, who told his guests, "I'm not interested in the destruction of the world, but if you want us all to meet you in hell, it's up to you." Meanwhile, at the White House, news was constantly arriving, hours behind reality at sea, about the progress of Soviet ships approaching the blockade line and thus the possible shootouts. When the president authorized warships to drop practice depth charges to force a Soviet submarine to surface, Robert Kennedy wrote, "I think these few minutes were the time of gravest concern for the president. Was the world on the brink of a Holocaust? Was it our error? Was there something further that should have been done or not done?" His hands went up to his face and covered his mouth. He opened and closed his fist. His face seemed drawn, his eyes pained, almost grey. We stared at each other across the table. For a few fleeting seconds, it was almost as though no one else was there, and he was no longer the president. Then, in mid-meeting, a message was passed to CIA boss John McCone, who made a momentous announcement. "Mr. President, we have a preliminary report which seems to indicate that some of the Russian ships have stopped dead in the water." 7 minutes later, a second confirmatory message reached McCone. Dean Rusk said, "It looks like the other fella just blinked." And so, of course, Khrushchev had. That evening, Kennedy spoke with Harold Macmillan on the telephone. The president asked, according to the Prime Minister, straight out the $64,000 question, should he take out Cuba? Macmillan wrote in his diary, I said I'd like to think about this. It's just like a review called Beyond the Fringe, which takes off the leading politicians. Labour MP John Strachey wrote later, Mr. Macmillan's public pronouncements and what one heard about his private reactions sounded to me rather like those of a fussy old retired nanny, forever calling out, "Ho, ho, Master Jack, do be careful or the bad men will get you." The Economist magazine feared that Washington was driving Moscow into a corner. It wrote of, quote, "the ominous possibility that the blockade does not mark the end of American plans for action against Dr. Castro's land." Macmillan now messaged Kennedy, urging him to call off his blockade if the Russians would accept UN inspection of the Cuban missile sites and negotiate. This reflected a caution for which conservative Americans, especially uniformed ones, despised the Brits. They considered that the attitudes of many of Macmillan's people reflected an unworthy fear of the communists, symbolized by the disarmers' slogan, "Better red than dead." In Washington, the 27th of October later became known as Black Saturday because Armageddon seemed imminent. Khrushchev had sent a succession of confused but still defiant messages. He seemed stubbornly unwilling to remove his missiles. Cuban troops began firing at overhead American planes. A U-2 aircraft that had taken off on a routine mission from Alaska got lost and plunged 300 miles into Russian airspace, where MiGs were ordered to intercept it, and the Americans also scrambled fighters armed with nuclear-tipped missiles to protect their own plane. Only after 10 hours of suspense did the stray U-2 mercifully land back in Alaska after the pursuing Soviets failed to catch it. Meanwhile, over the Arctic, a Soviet bomber staged a nuclear test explosion, and on Saturday morning, a US bomber detonated a stupendous catch-up blast over the Pacific. Gravest of all, from Cuba, a Soviet anti-aircraft missile crew fired a salvo at an American U-2 75,000 feet above. Moscow had hours earlier told its commanders to prepare to withdraw their missiles. But in the chaos that seems to attend all Russian military operations, now as then, frustrated local commanders in Cuba, who had had enough of the Americans, fired anyway. The U-2 disintegrated. Its dead pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson, fell into a cane field. Only hours later did Kennedy and his advisors at the White House hear this news, which seemed to show a Soviet commitment to escalate. Somebody at the White House table said grimly, "They fired the first shot." More were expected to follow. In London, Defence Minister Peter Thorneycroft recalled seeing Whitehall deserted and silent that weekend. Rather a lovely morning, and just thinking, my God, I wonder whether this really is it. In Washington, Bobby Kennedy wrote later, "Those hours in the cabinet room could never be erased from the minds of any of us. We saw as never before the meaning and responsibility involved in the power of the United States, the power of the president, responsibility he had to people around the world who'd never heard of our country or the men sitting in that room determining their fate, making a decision which would influence whether they would live or die." Finally, again, defying his military brass, Jack Kennedy said on that Saturday, "We won't attack tomorrow. We shall try again." It seems to me that those words would have represented no contemptible epitaph for him. He dispatched another letter to Khrushchev, saying that in return for withdrawal of the missiles from Cuba, the US would formally undertake to mount no further military operations against Cuba. His brother Bobby drove to deliver a copy personally to the Soviet ambassador. He warned Anatoly Dobrynin that time was running short before the US took military action. But he also offered a private undertaking that if the missiles went home, the US would within months remove its own Jupiters from Turkey. Robert Kennedy later recalled his own words to the Russian. "We had to have a commitment by at least tomorrow that those bases would be removed. This was not an ultimatum," I said, "but just a statement of fact. If they did not remove those bases, we would." The president, meanwhile, sat down to watch a screening of Roman Holiday with Gregory Peck and Audrey Hepburn. Earlier that evening, an aide had taken advantage of Jackie Kennedy's overnight absence to smuggle into the White House mansion Mimi Beardsley, an intern in the White House press office. Her inability to type was no handicap in her real role as one of the president's lovers. Although she allegedly chatted to Kennedy, that evening she found him understandably preoccupied and no sexual encounter took place. Even the relentlessly priapic president had too much else on his mind. The 19-year-old, according to her own account, slept in the next room while the two men watched their movie. In Moscow, it was already late morning on Sunday the 28th when Khrushchev summoned the Presidium to an emergency meeting to discuss Kennedy's letter. His foreign policy advisor wrote later, "The First Secretary was keenly aware, as were all of us, that in the situation that had arisen, when nerves on both sides were strained to breaking point, a single spark might cause an explosion." Khrushchev told the comrades, "We find ourselves face to face with the threat of war and nuclear catastrophe, as the result of which human civilization may perish. To save humanity, we should retreat. I have called you all together to consider whether you agree with such a decision." The whole meeting recognized the urgency in the light of reports that an American assault was imminent. Khrushchev emphasized that once the offered deal was struck, Castro would be safe because the US would pursue no further military operations against Cuba. Nobody around the table viewed this as a great Soviet victory, however, since he also admitted that the USSR's ballistic missiles would be brought home. When the chairman sat down, only Mikoyan and Gromyko spoke. In the words of a participant, the others preferred to remain silent, as if giving to understand, "It was you who got us into this mess. Now get yourself out of it." Although some of the comrades privately seethed towards Khrushchev, all bowed to the inevitability of surrender. Moreover, even as they talked, Khrushchev received an emotional letter cabled from Fidel Castro, appearing to urge that if the Americans invaded his island, the Soviet Union should deliver a nuclear first strike against the US. The Soviet leader said later, "We were completely aghast. Only a person who has no idea what thermonuclear war means or has been so blinded like Castro by revolutionary passion can talk like that." The Presidium was now convinced that it had only hours before the Americans attacked, while its Cuban client was talking like a madman. Khrushchev decided that the USSR's surrender had become so urgent that instead of dispatching a ciphered cable response to Washington, his agreement to remove the missiles should be publicly broadcast at 5 p.m. mid-Sunday morning, Washington time. Moscow radio was alerted. Yuri Levitan, its most famous announcer, was summoned from home to read the text over the air. Yet when speed might be a matter of mankind's life and death, the black Chaika limousine carrying Khrushchev's message first lost its way, then became delayed by traffic. When the hapless apparatchik finally dashed into the radio building and entered the lift, this juddered to a halt between floors. This being a Sunday, no engineer was on duty. Only after several minutes of blind, trapped panic did the lift suddenly and inexplicably judder into life again, delivering the messenger to the studio. Levitan, whose deep voice had made him Stalin's favorite mouthpiece, delivered his historic broadcast. In Washington, Kennedy and his civilian advisors succumbed to relief and rejoicing. At the Pentagon, however, the US chiefs of staff refused to believe a word of it. They messaged the president, "The JCS interpret the Khrushchev statement to be an effort to delay direct action by the United States while preparing for diplomatic blackmail." The chiefs asked Kennedy to order airstrikes against Cuba the next day to be followed by invasion. Curtis LeMay did not hide his rage that the USAF's beautiful bombing plan had suddenly become redundant. Navy Chief Admiral George Anderson's reaction was, "We have been had." This caused the president to say wearily, "The military are mad." A sense of anticlimax, however welcome, overtook Harold Macmillan's room in London. he said to the little cluster of intimates who lingered after his ministers had gone home, it's like a wedding where there's nothing left to do but drink the champagne and go to sleep. In New York, veteran CBS News correspondent Charles Collingwood told tens of millions of Americans, "This is the day we have every reason to believe the world came out from under the most terrible threat of nuclear holocaust since World War II." Our gratitude today for Kennedy's handling of the missile crisis must be increased by recognizing that less than half his successors as America's commander-in-chief could have been relied upon to make the same calls. Almost from the outset, Kennedy determined to strike a bargain with the Soviets rather than attempt to bludgeon them into submission. He expected to pay a price in order to secure peacefully his unwavering objective, removal of the missiles. The optimism about global peace that swept the West in 1991 and lasted through the first post-Cold War decades today appears naive. A return to great power competition has become a defining feature of the 2020s. Russia's only significant exports are oil, gas, and extreme violence. Yet these enable President Putin to wield astonishing clout for unflaggingly malign purposes. He exercises more personal authority than did First Secretary Khrushchev. Meanwhile, the institutions of the United States find themselves under siege from within by forces, some of which must be described as neo-fascist, in a fashion that America's 1962 leaders would find incomprehensible and terrifying. What's happening today is not a replay of the old Cold War, but it is a breakdown of order and stability, the most precious possessions in the international order. 60 years ago, even the Kremlin's hawks recognized that in a nuclear showdown, there could be only one winner, if such a word can be used even pejoratively, which would not be the USSR. This knowledge had a decisive impact on Soviet decisions. Today, by contrast, both China and Russia wield terrifying nuclear power to destroy us all, whatever the limitations of their conventional forces. Putin's willingness to take huge risks and initiate hideous atrocities in pursuit of a pan-Slav fantasy is increased by his consciousness of China's giant progress, of America's continuing technological mastery alongside Russia's stagnation. Putin's view of history is skewed by a mingling of ignorance, amorality, and nationalism, blended with his country's long-cherished narrative of grievance and victimhood. His conduct towards Ukraine is less defensible, both morally and legally, than was Khrushchev's in Cuba. It's a theme of my book that those who today dismiss the perils of the missile crisis because neither Kennedy nor Khrushchev wanted nuclear war are mistaken. In 1962, the world got lucky. Our hopes for averting future catastrophe must rely upon 21st century national leaders never for a second losing sight of the enormity of the danger posed by the weapons at their command. If any fragment of good has emerged from the huge evil of the invasion of Ukraine, it's been to awaken oversleeping Europeans to the importance of security, which requires both political will and military capability. In 1962, the US administration could not have achieved a tolerable outcome of the missile crisis without being known by Moscow to possess the means and to be believed also to have the will to unleash overwhelming force in support of its diplomacy. A rightful motto for every national leader, now as then, is be afraid. Neither John F. Kennedy nor Nikita Khrushchev was deficient in personal courage. But what distinguished them from Fidel Castro and some military commanders on both sides is that the two were alike prudently haunted by consequences. The principal imperative for our planet's prospect of surviving the 21st century beyond confronting climate change is that no national leader shows themselves deficient in the fear which must lie at the heart of wisdom and which was indispensable to a peaceful resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Thank you all very much indeed.